Today we're going to talk about landscape. As you can see, the essential question is what about fore, middle, and background is important to creating a landscape? Again, the scaffolded notes are in the bottom right that you can take some notes as we go through this presentation in case there are any quizzes that come up. The learning targets for this unit are, I understand foreground, middle ground, and background and can apply them convincingly in my work. I can create a unique perspective as a landscape drawing, utilizing experimentation with media and unified value, using chalk pastel, oil pastel, watercolor, gouache, or a combination of 2D art media. I can create a landscape drawing that convincingly uses the style of a resource artist to create value in my drawing that has enough contrast to see all of the objects easily. As like the other assignments, we're going to be using the strong work Venn diagram to create really strong artwork. That means you're going to be using things like the rule of thirds, the design elements and principles, experimentation with media and techniques, and communicating some sort of idea. You can also see there's a resource artist link in the bottom left so that you can take a look at what other master artists have done to become inspired. Just like every other assignment, we're going to be using the design process of think, make, and improve. Right now we're talking about the unit, so we'll be thinking a lot about what the requirements are and any other techniques or a combination of things that we need to do. Shortly we're going to be making things, and then obviously there's critiques and your digital portfolio where we will be improving the work that we've done. Just like any other assignment, you should be creating some thumbnail sketches. Here you can see some thumbnail sketches of landscapes on the left. The requirements for the landscape drawing are going to be that your landscape should be created with either reflections or from an unusual viewpoint. You also need to think about color scheme and mood. In addition, you need to try to communicate a message in the final landscape drawing that is unified in all parts of the artwork. And then on the bottom, you can see that you'll be utilizing at least one of the following. That would be experimental background, which are collage and color field, that you've perhaps tried a watercolor painting. The third option is using multiple value techniques in a variety of media. And the last suggestion is creating a landscape that is en plein air, which means it's created while you're outside. So just to explain the parts of a landscape. Foreground is obviously the portion of the landscape or objects that are closest to the viewer. The middle ground would be those things that are in the middle of the picture frame. And then the background are the things that are farthest from us. So if we take a look at this particular picture, I'm wondering what you might think the middle ground is versus what the background might be. And how are you going to ensure that you have these distinct things in your landscape drawing? So hopefully you can see there is a man that's actually in the foreground here. The middle ground would be where this farmstead and the trees are, and then the background obviously is the sky and the sun and the clouds. So another thing about the foreground and background in this particular image on the left. Hopefully you can see that in the background there are parts of the island and the ocean behind those palm trees on the upper right. And then you can see that in the foreground there are tiles from a pathway, and then there is actually a fence that leads you along that pathway as well, with the wheel of a ship there on the left. So some things about message or mood in a landscape. This particular piece is called Angelus by Millet. As you can see, the couple is praying over the amount of potatoes that came out of the ground. So this was actually during the Irish potato famine, and you can see how thankful the individuals are that they were given any food at all. And then in the background, in the very, very background, you can see that church way in the background. One other thing about message or mood, you want to remember that technically colors can portray different moods as well. And so here I gave you a wheel with different colors and the different meanings that are associated with those colors. So this is actually a Van Gogh piece, and hopefully you can see there's kind of a melancholy mood created because of the dark sky, and then of course because of the birds, the crows that are in the sky and hovering over the land. If we think about these two paintings, I'm wondering what you think is being communicated in here. So if you take a look at these paintings done by Wayne Thiebaud, technically they are of the freeway systems in larger cities. So I'm kind of thinking that he is trying to communicate the hustle and bustle of the cars that are on the freeway. And then on the image on the right, you can actually even see he's also communicating a little bit of the pollution that is created from all the factories that are around the freeways in the cities. Here's another piece that I want you to think about with having message or mood. If you actually take a look at this, it's composed very well in the rule of thirds because there's a person in the upper left-hand quadrant in that rowboat, and the rowboat's actually at a diagonal, creating your eye to move around the composition because it goes from the fish up to the man in the rowboat, over probably to the sky, and then back down again into that turbulent water that you're seeing. So hopefully you can tell too, all those diagonals and those really rocky waves are actually creating kind of an uneasiness of whether or not this man is going to be able to reach the ship that is in the background there. It's on the upper right-hand side of the composition. Here's another person that has been shipwrecked. Here you can see the man collapsed after having the ordeal on the ocean after his boat crashed onto the island. So one other thing that I want you to think about with the message or mood is you can create that obviously in different brush strokes. Here, I want you to also notice Winslow Homer did a lot of his works with a specific kind of media. Hopefully you can tell that he actually was a watercolor painter. So again, here's another watercolor done by Homer, and you can see he was really interested in creating the waves in the ocean and also some reflection, because you can see the man is being reflected into the ocean a little bit. And then there is that island in the background in the upper right. So another message and mood. This man is just trying to stay in the boat, and there are sharks in the foreground in front of him. So technically the man is in the middle ground, and then you can actually see there's more sharks farther back, and then there's clouds way in the background, and he's just trying to survive that turbulent sea. So obviously there's an apprehension going on in the mood of this piece. This piece is super tranquil. Hopefully you can see the difference. There's no wind, and you can see the different reflections of the people in the water. Again, it is a watercolor. It was done by Homer. Remember that you're going to have to practice watercolor techniques if you haven't already done so. Specifically, you want to practice wet on wet and wet on dry. Here you can actually see a wet on dry technique that Homer used. And the reason that you can tell that is there's a very stark line in places like in the clouds, and then also again in the reflections. You can see an exact edge of where one color is creating values from another. So this slide just has a link to the watercolor techniques video. Again, you're going to want to put a piece of paper on a board and tape that down in order to do that, but you could click on the link and watch that video after this presentation is done. And then it just gives you the explanation of the different kinds of techniques you're going to want to try on your paper as you do that. Another thing you want to think about when you're creating your landscape are different kinds of value techniques. So here you can see Waterloo Bridge, which was created by Monet. Hopefully you can see the light that is created there. In the right-hand side, there's a sunrise going on, but again, because of the clouds in the sky, and it looks like there might even be a little bit of pollution in the background because you can see smoke coming out of one of the buildings in the back. Hopefully you can see a scumbling value technique was used. This is another one of the Impressionists. It's a Degas. It is a drawing of a horse race, and hopefully you can see the different value techniques. So sometimes the person used line rendering, which are parallel lines to create value in the grass, and then they blended the values together and smudged them a little bit more in the horses and riders. Again, this is showing how different value techniques can create different contrast in what you are trying to portray. This happens to be a painting by Eakins, and hopefully you can see he used a smoother value technique in the boat and in the rowers, and then he used more of a scumbling technique in the trees. And it's actually almost a line rendered technique that he was using in the front of the boat there to create the waves in the river or lake that they are on. This is another Van Gogh, and again, you can see his very iconic style of using line rendering as he was painting. This is the Japanese bridge at Giverny. That is Monet's estate. Hopefully you'll notice that in the color and style, he was using a very scumbled technique for the most part, but then obviously there were some areas where he smudged it a little bit more in order to create areas of contrast. So in the water, you can see it smudged more so that in that scumbled area where the lily pads are and where the trees and other foliage are, it's creating a contrast from the bridge and the smoother parts of the water. Remember, Monet was considered one of the Impressionists, and again, they were more about the quality of light in artwork. So one other thing I want you to think about as you are creating your landscape is perspective. That's why we talk about perspective in drawing one. Here you can see that the buildings are receding because the object or doorway that's in the left-hand side of this image is much larger than the tables, and then the people get even smaller as you go back in the cafe, and the buildings get even smaller way in the back. Notice how he also made those buildings get darker to give you that illusion of depth. So another thing that you need to think about with perspective is creating an unusual viewpoint. This happens to be a black and white photograph by Ansel Adams, and although we're not doing black and white drawings, I just wanted to show you something that was a little bit more unusual. So really here what you're seeing is Ansel Adams is capturing an Anasazi village inside a cave, and then you can actually see that the cliff face extends even higher than that. Here's another landscape created by Gauguin. Gauguin was technically part of Post-Impressionism along with Van Gogh, but here he actually also created the birth of Fauvism. So what that means is that he used a lot of colors that were really bright and not necessarily the exact colors that he was seeing in the landscape. Another thing that Gauguin was known for was creating more of a patchwork style. So there are some values in his drawings, but his work is a little bit more flat, and it actually almost looks like it could be like a square of a quilt. So here's another different style. This is done by Grant Wood, and it is called The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Hopefully you can see that the buildings in the town are illuminated and very large, and then as the road goes back into space, you can see that the road gets much smaller, and there is what looks like the British, because it's again the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. It might be the British on their horses way in that upper right, and Paul Revere is warning the rest of the town about that. This is another landscape done by Grant Wood. And hopefully you can see his work is much more stylized. It's not as photorealistic. And hopefully you can see that not only in the way that he's portraying the haystacks and trees and other parts of the landscape, but also that the color and value that's created is not photorealistic. Another thing that we need to talk about is style. So this happens to be a painting by Cézanne. It is of the French countryside, and you can see it is it includes the mountains in the background, a viaduct in the middle ground, and then those trees that are in the foreground of the painting. What you need to realize about Cézanne's style is it was in a style called Cubism, where he used very square brush strokes. It's not as evident in this piece, but if we go forward to this next slide, hopefully you can see the very square brush strokes of another painting by Cézanne of the same mountain from a different location. The next two drawings are going to be M.C. Escher. He really was the master of creating an unusual viewpoint. So here you can see a carp in what looks like it might be a river, and there are leaves over the top of the water, and then you can actually see trees as the reflection on the top. This is another really unusual landscape drawing because, again, you're seeing the reflections of the trees in that puddle, and then there's footprints and tire treads that go through that composition as well. Here's another piece done by Jacob Lawrence. It's actually a rooftop in New York City. And again, he was very much a poster painter, and you can actually see because he was creating these for larger posters, there's not very much value used in his compositions at all. Contrasting from that, a different style done by Johannes Vermeer. This is called Thunder over Delft. He was very much concerned with trying to be very photorealistic, where you can see the shadow of the clouds over the town. Another way that you could create your work would be to zoom in on the objects that you are trying to portray. So for example, this happens to be a bunch of iris flowers that Van Gogh zoomed in on instead of showing the entire layout of the garden or the backyard or wherever he was painting these flowers from. Here's another even more zoomed in piece done by Georgia O'Keeffe. It's called Flowers of Fire. It's really a close-up of an iris, and she was most concerned about getting the textures and colors in the composition. This is another landscape done by Edward Weston. Part of the reason that I show these different photographers too is hopefully you can almost see the figures that are going on in this particular landscape. It's technically sand dunes, and he's calling it ocean because they look like waves kind of, but they also to some people look like body parts. So this is a landscape done by Matisse, and it's of the inside of a building. I just want you to think about using cool colors to represent things that are deeper in a composition and warm colors to represent the things that are lighter. So this is actually the opposite of what we normally see because the warm colors are outside the window and most of this room is really dark because the darker, cooler colors are on the inside of the building. This is another drawing done by Monet. It was probably, again, a view of Giverny or his estate. And you can see he's really playing with the light and shadow that happen when sunlight goes through the trees. You can actually see the leaves are reflected as shadows along this pathway. They're represented by that darker or cooler colors on the path, and then the sunlight that's coming through is a much warmer tone. So again, if you're trying to create reflections, one thing you want to think when you're doing reflections is that they actually mirror each other. And you can take a piece of tracing paper and trace the object that you've done that exists in real life and then invert it in order to draw the reflection. So you can actually see that in the willow tree that's on the right-hand side of that bridge painting. And then you can also see a little bit of it. It's more of a shadow underneath that boat and underneath the bridge. But again, when something is reflected, it's going to go vertically down from something. And that kind of depends on what's being reflected, because if the bridge was being reflected, as you can see in the image on the right, it's actually reflected horizontally. It's really hard to see the reflection of the bridge because the lily pads get in the way, but hopefully you guys can see that as well. So here's another reflection of lights from the buildings that are in that town. They're reflecting into the water and they're actually elongated from where he was when he was painting this. You can also see he was trying to illuminate the stars more by creating a glow around the stars. And again, combining different techniques where he's smudging parts together and then creating, it almost looks like he scumbled in the water. But because this is Van Gogh, we know he was creating those very line rendered marks with his paintbrush. So again, when you're thinking of different times of day, you might want to really take a look at what colors you're seeing in the composition. And regardless of what you use, there's lots of different color combinations that you can come up with in all of the different media. So this is another Monet that he painted in winter, and hopefully you can see the different colors that are used in this painting as opposed to the one we just saw. The colors in the winter painting are much darker and there's a lot more blues in them as opposed to the pinks and greens that were used in the haystack painting. When you're thinking of your landscape, the last thing that you really need to think about is the rule of thirds. So here you can see Van Gogh took that cypress tree and he chose to make that really large in the left-hand side of his composition. Then he took those curvilinear lines in the sky to show the Milky Way and the moon. And then obviously he also used a little bit of perspective because he's showing that the town is a lot smaller and farther away than what that cypress tree is. As you continue to create your landscape, you do need to remember to take process photos for your digital portfolio so that you can then analyze the design process outcomes as part of your page. As you're doing that, remember you do have to also compare your work to a resource artist, and it's really important to highlight any terms and techniques that you might be using in your reflections. You should be able to summarize the essential question from above earlier, and then we are going to start working on your landscape.